Remember low taxes? Remember free market? Remember free capitalism? Free capital? Remember free speech? Do you remember the Bible and people's respect for it? Remember when people respected Jesus? You remember when the word tolerance meant to tolerate everyone, regardless of what their points of view were? Remember the Constitution? You remember when it was the crooks and the criminals and the thugs who were demonized instead of the law-abiding citizens? Do you remember when regular TV wasn't as graphic and nasty and pornographic almost as cable? Do you remember when sex was not equated with race? Do you remember when presidents loved America? Do you remember when presidents were born in America? Do you remember when presidents loved Jesus? Do you remember when presidents acknowledged the day, the National Day of Prayer? Do you remember when rhinos didn't run Congress? Do you remember when people weren't so easily duped? Do you remember when there was only one Messiah? Do you remember when handouts weren't a goal in life? Do you remember when people were, who were receiving welfare and food stamps were ashamed? Do you remember trying to get welfare or handouts wasn't an occupation? Do you remember small government? Do you remember real black leaders? Real black leaders? Do you remember when people weren't so cowardly? People brought things to your face and people took it to your face. And we never had the knockout game. Do you remember when we weren't so wimpified and sissified that we get our feelings hurt over every little word that's said? Do you remember when most Christians, real Christians, stood on the word? Do you remember when it was okay to stand by the word? Do you remember when phobia actually meant fear? Do you remember when gay meant happy? Do you remember when we warned you about Obamacare? Do you remember when there were more colors than black and white? Do you remember when blacks had some kind of conservative values? Do you remember when people didn't judge you for your race and use the race to make a whole lot of money? Do you remember when hate wasn't such a big, lucrative business? Do you remember when illegal activity wasn't rewarded? Do you remember love and harmony? Do you remember human love regardless of race, color, and creed? Do you remember when being a patriot didn't mean being an enemy? Do you remember where it was taboo and almost criminal to disrespect the American flag, even dance on it? Remember America? Like it or not.